Hello, everyone. Welcome to Streaming Media Connect 2024, our 14th, if you can believe it, Connect event. I am your Media Universe cartographer, Evan Shapiro. I'll also be your Grandmaster Flash of ceremonies all week. And I'll be joined this week by many of streaming's biggest and brightest brains to bring you 3 days of content-packed panels and great conversations on cloud streaming, live sports, streaming, top streaming gear, CTV and fast, AI, ROI, data, metrics, and monetization, all this kind of stuff. As always, great content with great people. And it's really good to be all with you today on a very nice week here in New York City. Before we get started, I want to play a special video from our sponsor, AMD. Steve, hit it. I want to thank AMD for sponsoring this opening research keynote. And before we get to the keynote itself, a little bit of busy work here. As you heard while we were walking on, as it were, there was music playing. For the first person who can name the band and or act and the song that was just playing and is here at the end of the panel. So you have to not just name the act and the song, but also stay here through the end of the panel. You will win a $50 gift card from Amazon, courtesy of Streaming Media Connect. A couple of other things, please chat in the chat. So if you have things you want to add or links you want to post, and Steve and our Tyler, our producers, will add links to bios of the panelists and other information there in the chat. But if you have questions for the panelists, please put those in Q&A. Otherwise, we can't see your cues and we can't give you RA. All the sessions from this week on Streaming Media Connect will be on Streaming Media's YouTube channel next week, and there'll be a link in the chat for that. Now, with all that busy work out of the way, let's kick off Streaming Media Connect this week with our opening research keynote, Current Trends in Ultra-Low Latency Interactive Live Streaming. We've got some really big brains to talk about this. So welcome to the stage, Tim Fore-Siglin, founder of Help Me Stream Research Foundation, Steve Kelly, our editor at Streaming Media, and our surprise guest and a good friend, Dom Robinson, CBDO, Ideas, and Norsk. Take it away, guys.
Do I look surprised? That's the key thing. Do I look surprised?
No, you're not surprised. You are a surprise. Please stay with the context.
Dom, it feels like the old Snap days where we're walking on going, oh, wait, yes, we have someone else on here with us. So thank you very much for joining, because this is a topic I know that you actually feel passionate about, especially when it comes to things like the power consumption side, which we'll get to later. And Steve, as always, thank you for being part of this. So like Evan said, I'm Timothy Fore-Siglin. I'm the founding executive director of Help Me Stream Research Foundation. This survey is a year in the making almost. We talked to AMD about this probably around November 23. And one of the things that they see the market moving toward, like we have seen with the state of streaming surveys, is that we've reached that tipping point in 2022 where we're doing more live than on demand. And when you do live, you have to be able to get the content out quickly, but you also have to be able to get it out cost effectively and hopefully keep your power consumption low across the board. So we premised it about a year ago. We put it up about 3 weeks ago. So this is sort of a quick hit survey that AMD sponsored. And again, thank you, as Evan said, to AMD for sponsoring it, because this is a topic that the industry really needs to take a look at. So let's, with no further ado, Steve, if you wouldn't mind, jump us to slide 3. So normally on these surveys, and I'm just going to level set on a few of these demographic slides. Normally on these surveys, it's roughly 80% from North America, about 12% from Europe, and the rest of the world covers the remainder. On this one, we actually got a much more balanced. We have just under 70% for North America, almost 20% for Europe, and then Asia Pacific and India. And India popped up with there were some very good comments and feedback in the survey from India. South America has continued to grow as a market, as we've seen in our state of streaming surveys. So the takeaway from this slide is essentially we have a global response on this one, even more global than we've had on most of our surveys. The next slide is a bit of an eye chart, and I apologize for this. When you see the report that will come out in a few weeks here, you'll be able to read most of this. But the takeaway is those who took the survey, roughly 20% of them work in companies that have channels, whether it's education, entertainment, sports, premium content, about 12% in the production space. And as is typical in our other state of streaming surveys, we have both OTT providers and over-the-air or pay TV providers. Then you can see it rounds out with content rights owners, religious organizations, education, etc. So again, both global and also covering multiple industries. So now on the next slide, let's jump into sort of the top 5 viewer devices that content is delivered to. And in this one, we've asked these questions across most of the state of streaming surveys. What we've found is that smart TVs, while there is a growing group of delivery to connected TVs and smart TVs, they still rank about halfway down the list. Smartphones, obviously, tablets, laptops, anything that's mobile, those tend to be much higher, especially in the live side. And Dom, I'm curious from your standpoint, as we've sort of looked both with greening of streaming, and if you even go back to your global mix days, has this changed much over the last decade or so, or does it sort of surprise you that connected TVs haven't necessarily risen to the top?
I still am surprised. I think the smartphone is possibly just much shorter interactions than I tend to think about. So when I think about putting an event on or putting a live stream on, I tend to think of it as being something like this, where people are going to, people have bothered to come together and put something with an hour's worth of content in it. And I think so a smartphone's not the most comfortable environment to sit and consume content for an hour on. So I think it always surprises me when I see them at the top, but I think they're statistically probably people diving in and out, dipping into webcasts for 5 minutes or into something interactive, So yeah, I think it does surprise me somewhat that the smart TV is so far down. But then measurements are measurements, statistics are statistics. It's always difficult, certainly, isn't it?
So I know one of the things you and I have talked about over the years has been the concept of, if you're watching something on demand, round tripping, of course, allowed us to watch part of it on our connected TV and then move to our smartphone to continue to watch it on the train. Like, say, if you're running up to London. With live events, do we find people are glued to a particular device, and once they start on that device, they stay? Or would it also be if a match is happening, and you have to do your commute, then you'll dip into it on your smartphone, as you say?
I think it's highly contextual. As soon as you said that, I was minded of being at a music festival this year, and there was some important sporting event on, and there were suddenly clusters of people standing around the one or two people who'd managed to get a signal on site. I've never seen, there must have been 2 or 3 clusters of about 100 people watching one smartphone in each cluster.
Wow.
So it never amazes me where people want to watch live streams. I think it really depends on the content.
It just demonstrates no matter where you are, there's something more interesting happening somewhere else.
For me, the best bit was realizing what was happening. I immediately got my stopwatch out, and I was timing the latency between the different groups and trying to work out who was on which signal. But that's just because I'm a streaming geek.
In fact, we'll talk about synchronization here later. That's a really good point. Fair point, Steve, that, ultimately, I guess with a mobile device, you can be in 2 places at one time, although you look sort of strange being at an event, looking at your phone and not paying attention to what's going on.
Well, I always thought we had the only conference where we would have a streaming keynote and more people would be watching the live stream in their seats at the keynote, and we're looking at the stage.
All right, let's move on to the next slide, and I'll touch on these 2 slides, and then we'll come to the next piece. So as with most of our surveys, we ask, do you create content or do you distribute content, or do you do both? This is actually the highest percentage we've had of people who both create and distribute content, 77%. Normally it hovers for the state of streaming surveys overall around 65 to 68%. So again, part of my takeaway on this is, if we're focusing on live streaming, there are more companies who actually are paying attention to needing to distribute the content. And Dom, to your point about doing big events, you're doing the production side of gathering content, and then you're doing the distribution side of making sure it goes out to a CDN or what have you.
Yeah, it's interesting. I wondered how well defined distribute is in people's minds as a word. That's a big catch to both create and distribute media there. And I think, over the years, I worked with CDN, content delivery networks, but used to be content distribution networks. And distribution's a little bit of a blurred word, because there's other parts of the broadcast media industry which talk about distribution in completely different contexts. So I think, I wonder whether the word might be being interpreted to mean downstream of the production, rather than specifically working with something that's moving volumes of bits out to audiences. I think distribute's a little bit of a woolly term.
And that is a definite valid point, because when you ask people, and there's a slide in here where we ask people about what they use, what platforms they use, YouTube Live, Facebook Live often come up, in which case they are thinking about where they're going to distribute the media, but they're ultimately not doing the distribution.
Not the yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yep. And syndication possibly falls into a trap in there as well. So I think that might be good to try to break that section out a little bit if it's becoming that dominant in the stats.
In the live space. Yep. All right, let's go on to the next slide. This is essentially where we ask companies to tell us, where do you find your bread and butter revenue? And obviously you can see this is the overall, and we'll come back later and we'll break a bit of this down. But overall, on-demand content is 30%. But if you take live events, live linear broadcast, and some of these other things like sports and news publishing, that comes up above the 30% mark.
I'm sorry, can I just interject a question? Who wants ultra-low latency on-demand content?
Again, this is a level set question just for us to understand.
Okay.
hopefully nobody wants it on that, because we'll
It's just a bit
we
of
get
the
on,
nightmare.
as we get on to the one of the other questions, we'll talk about the difference between faster than real-time transcoding and low latency on the streaming side. But so this gives us the understanding of the overall mix within businesses. And I think the sort of key takeaway here is, just like we've continued to see in the industry, most companies who are delivering are not just supporting one of these, they're supporting multiples. It always surprises me that education and houses of worship, in this case, take up not quite 25%, but a significant amount, because we think of those as, oh, that stuff's solved, and the churches or synagogues or universities all have their solutions. That's not true. They have to rely on somebody, especially if it's a large university, to help them with the distribution. And that's where streaming companies who provide those platforms come in. All right. And then moving on to the last sort of level set question. And again, this is for overall. We ask people, what's the average resolution of your content? We ask this each time. This one's actually markedly different from what we get with the state of streaming surveys. Most of the state of streaming surveys, the 720p content, whether it's the 50, 60 frames per second or the lower frame rates of 24, 25, 30, come up to around 25%. In this particular instance, and I think if we go back to the AMD video where they're talking about how many 1080p streams you can live transcode, the live industry, at least in North America and Europe, is firmly planted in the 1080p space. As you get into emerging markets and as we delve down through the data, obviously 720p for intermittent networks, especially 720p 50, 60 for sports, is a larger segment of emerging markets than it is in North America, in the US. What's also interesting here, and Dom, I know this is one of your hot buttons, 4K is actually not nearly as big as I would have expected. And we've actually seen over the last several state of streaming surveys a shrinkage on the 4K side, at least as represented by those who take the surveys. It brings you to the point of, is 1080p good enough, especially when it comes to sports for 1080p 50, 60? I'm going to give you a minute and a half to give your opinion, because I know this.
So I spoke at the ITU Future of TV conference last week, and it was quite interesting. Some of the other speakers were talking about penetration of different resolution standards, basically. And there was a general sort of sentiment that 4K had got some penetration, but really hadn't been as adopted as expected. Right. Despite codec efficiencies, actually there's a lot of sort of very successful incumbent formats and resolutions which are being used, and they do just work. So yeah, it's definitely an interesting area. I don't think 4K will disappear. I don't think it's about a failed standard. I think it's about if you've got a mix of 1080p and 4K production kit, then if you just work to 1080p across your workflow, you get a decent quality output. And until that's all upgraded to 4K, there's always going to be an inclination to run with the slowest resolution in the pack, if you like. And I think there's just a lot of 1080p kit out there. And as you can see in your chart there, I think that represents what I would expect, actually.
I was having.
I'm slightly surprised. I'm slightly surprised by the P60s, by the 1080p 60 higher frame rate stuff, actually. But
and again, I think that goes to the sports side of the equation. If I think live tends to fall towards content that may require high frame rates, where obviously the on-demand side, 24, 25, 30 are completely fine. I
mean, it's been a. Sorry, Tim.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say it's been an interesting discussion in green and streaming, because obviously 18 months ago there was sort of a lot of talk about 8K and a lot of fairly confused thinking about how energy networks works, but it led to some pushback in European regulatory space on 8K as a standard. I think personally, probably based on some estimations rather than some actual work, which needs to probably be done before anyone really knows what the energy efficiencies are in those senses. But I think that might have made the consumer as a whole stop and go, do I care anymore? Do I even know? And if they've stopped demanding more Ks, it's less of a boiling point for selling workflow, for selling services, and just changes things. So I think 1080p is probably a good enough medium for a long time to come.
Well, and what's interesting, in fact, what I was going to say before you said that about 8K, I was having a conversation yesterday with a game developer, and his take was interesting because he works in very high frame rates, obviously 60 frames. And he was sort of saying the thing that we all said back when 1080p came out: if we can only get to 1080p, it looks so lifelike, there wouldn't be anything we need beyond that. Well, he and I had the conversation around, the consumer technology of we need to sell you the next biggest TV, 4K, which pushed the price of 1080p down, which pushed the price of 720p. And he was saying, well, I really want to see us get to 8K, because if we get to 8K, we won't need anything beyond that. So I asked him, I said, do you use 4K on your Netflix subscriptions? He said, well, I used it for a while, then I realized it wasn't actually truly getting 4K. So I down priced to the next level. And I'm using 1080p, and to me, it looks just as good as what I was seeing in the 4K, because I wasn't always getting 4K delivery. So it's that reality of, on one hand, that the consumer device manufacturers want to push you forward with higher resolution screens, but the reality of delivering it is harder. And and especially if we're talking live, the intermittency of the networks also comes into play, because if you drop a 4K frame, it's essentially like you're dropping 5 to 7 1080p 24 frames.
So just a little plug here. We're actually gonna revisit this 4K. Will the heyday of 4K come in 2025 or ever? We're gonna revisit that in a debate tomorrow at 4 p.m. Eastern time. So
awesome. There you go.
Is it going to be followed? Is it going to be followed with is RTMP dead yet?
The answer from our last survey, Dom, is it's not only dead, it's actually gaining traction, because we did one on streaming technology trends, and RTMP is actually surprisingly doing.
There we go.
Anyway, go ahead.
The package that will never die. I think 10-bit and HDR are actually probably more important evolutions for the consumer than resolution at this stage. I think the people who want ultra high resolution tend to sit with the screen too close to them, and their mum will tell them off.
And I 100% agree that HDR is actually something that I hope sees more traction, at least in the short run, than 4K does. All right, speaking of that, now let's talk about low latency applications on the next slide. And here we asked respondents to rank their top. Well, actually, we just asked them to rank, and then we pulled the top 6, which are over on the left. What are the low latency, ultra low latency, or interactive streaming applications? And we define this as typically those considered below 200 milliseconds of latency. The reason we do that, define it as 200 milliseconds, is there is still a significant amount of confusion around what is low latency, what is ultra low latency, what is real time. My perception in the market is that companies market themselves as ultra low latency or real time, and yet they'll tell you that they're 500 milliseconds, and that, by the definitions of all these, are not true. Wowza had asked me several years ago to put together a chart, which I found interesting. It got resurrected recently by an analyst in the industry who said, see this chart, this is what defines it. That was 4 years ago that they asked me to do that. It still, to this day, we do not have a firm industry definition around ultra low latency. So caveat emptor from the standpoint of beware of companies selling you that, make sure that you get it defined as to what it is, and then take a look at this list and decide whether your application actually fits to it. So Dom, I have a question for you, and Steve, a question for you as well. So we've got betting and wagering came in as number 3. Sportsbook came in as number 8. Not being a gambler myself, can somebody explain to me the difference between those two?
You picked the wrong person for that one.
Steve, have at it.
Yeah, I mean, we did just before we started here, we did try to sort this one out, and I don't think we really came to a conclusion. I mean, I think a sports book is on site at a casino, and maybe they're talking with betting wagering. They're talking about prop betting in a venue at a game. I don't, at a match. I don't know. But I do think one thing
Jason in the
that
chat room, Jason in the chat room might know. I think
Yeah.
he's angling for a prize.
So I think one of the takeaways that I have here on this one is, at least as I see sports betting in the States emerge, and Dom, obviously you've had it for a long time in the UK and Europe. It seems like a lot of that is app-based, and they're not necessarily, they're maybe watching the game on television and then putting in a spot bet on an app, because the latency issues that we run into in trying to deliver the live streams at scale mean that we're typically 25 to 30 seconds behind what the live broadcast is. I guess, Dom, having had that in the UK, is there a move to do apps with low latency streams that you bet in, or do we sort of keep those two separate?
Over the years, I've sort of been involved with a number of different live streaming betting applications. So in the sort of mid 2000s, when everything was largely RTMP flash based, because that was the lower latency option of the day, they had to shut the betting gate. They used to shut it about 8 to 10 seconds ahead, and they were fairly confident that they weren't. They weren't. They tried to shut the gate as late as possible, because in that build-up, the tension of the sort of final point where you can place the bet is when all the bets get placed. So if you shut it 10 seconds before the end to leave a buffer so that you don't have a sort of sting position or whatever, there's a name for it, I can't remember what it's called, but just as was in the Sting film, where they race the information with the bet. That's it. Basically, and so the principle has always been to bring that latency right down so you can shut the betting as late as possible. So it's not so much that it's because it's also available on a broadcast medium, because quite often it isn't. Quite often the bookies have bought all the rights to all the little sports or all the racing, so that they can offer that through their betting facility, their betting shop, or their betting app, or whatever it is. So the latency was really it has been focused on trying to keep the betting gate open as long as possible. That extra 10 seconds makes a lot of money.
And it's interesting you say that, because a short distance horse race, it could be over in less than 30 seconds. So, I mean, if we're looking at
right, but the betting usually stops as the race starts. But
as the race starts,
10 seconds before, because you've got some people who are on an RTMP feed or whatever, then you lose that 10 seconds of betting.
The other 2 points I'm going to make here on this slide before we move on, just for sake of time, is real-time weather alerts. We're actually doing we're doing a keynote presentation with the weather company on Thursday around live feeds of weather information. And what we find consistently there is that when severe weather happens, people turn to the device that has the lowest latency, which is typically television and or radio. So the fact that this popped up in the top 6 tells me that that is a potential market as well. Because if you think about needing, I don't need weather information 20 seconds delayed if I'm in the middle of a hurricane or a tornado. I need that now to make a decision.
Do you? I'm just trying. I'm trying to put myself in that position. I was. Does that?
So I'll give you an example of this, Dom, because I live on the Tennessee-North Carolina border, and of course we had the major hurricane that came through. There is a point where I live, and this may just be specific to me, but there's a point where I live that the TV radar coverage covers to within about 10 miles of where I live. There is a mountain close to the edge of that coverage that the tornadoes will either bounce to the northwest or they'll bounce to the northeast. If they bounce to the northwest, I need to be in shelter. If they bounce to the northeast, I'm okay. But the problem there is, do I really want to be in my living room watching my 70-inch TV on the bet that I'm going to have to take shelter, in the next 20 seconds? That's one from that standpoint.
Yeah, well, we don't have any weather situations like tornadoes here in south of the UK. So,
fair enough.
I think we just need about a 6 months warning of sunshine.
And then the other one that I wanted to point out is online gaming esports. Going back to the conversation I was having with the gaming developer, this is an area where both high frame rates, HDR to a certain extent, and low latency come into sort of a sweet spot. I think it's interesting that it actually rose above betting and wagering, but in the esports space, the ability to move high frame rate content at low latency, I do think is a very nice application for this the interactive streaming part of this. All right, moving on then. So I mentioned earlier that we asked people about where they do their content processing workflows. And this gets to your question, Dom, sort of partially on distribution. You'll notice 21% say they still do it on premise, 27% AWS, and then we have a slice of roughly 11% that do a hybrid of on-prem and cloud. The takeaway on this one, I think, as we get into some of the later slides that have quotes, is cloud services, while they're still dominant, we're starting to see a shift back more toward the hybrid model. So you take a look at what you can do on site inexpensively, and then you take a look at what you need to scale and you move that into the cloud. The other thing that's interesting over here on the right is current CDN delivery strategies. We sort of parsed this down and looked at live versus overall. Live has a much bigger percentage of multi-CDN, so having that failover, and I know, Dom, when you've done big events, music festivals, and like that, that's sort of the standard, is make sure you have a fail safe. You want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, so some of the cloud structures have, I think you can consider to be large enough that you can do a failover within a cloud, but you probably want to have vendor autonomy too. So actually having fully diverse CDN strategies, fully diverse cloud strategies, is how you achieve high availability. You can't rely on single points of failure, and you have to have an architecture which is built anticipating failure at all points, and you'll never defend and make a perfect system. It's much better to have a strategy for how you're going to deal with everything failing all the time. Chaos monkeys, bring them back. But
absolutely.
But so I think I agree. I think I've seen more of a tendency to actually understand the economics of where you want to run your computing. I think we can call it hybrid and on cloud, but really they're ways of paying for people's computers. And I think there is significant benefit to making sure your mainstay 24/7 workloads are run in-house under tight constraints around your specific workflow, as long as you don't have underutilized platforms. If you have a lot of underutilization, then it's worth trying to move that into shared underutilization of the cloud, which sadly is hugely over-provisioned, but that's a slightly different set of challenges. But at least getting some of that static requirement back under your own command can actually bring really good economic savings over running in the cloud at the moment.
Very true. All right, I'm going to click through the next two slides here fairly quickly. This is overall, we ask people to indicate the mix of live and on-demand in their business, and what you see is about half and half. Did any part of your content processing workflow use hardware acceleration? This surprised me. It was a bit higher than I expected, but we'll get in a few slides into why this might be the case. The next slide, we actually talk about what percentage of the live streaming workflow requires video transcoding. And this proves the point on the fact that both from a trans rating standpoint, which is lowering the data rate, as well as a true transcoding standpoint where you're changing between codecs, whether it's AVC H.264 to VP9 or AV1 or HEVC, there is a significant need to transcode, because when you're trying to hit multiple device types, each device type has a preferential codec or frame rate. And we don't really have much time for discussion on this, but take away from this slide that if you're looking at doing live streaming, you have to pay attention to the fact that you need to transcode, because one size does not fit all in any means. The next slide, slide 13, we talk about the sort of asking people what they do in terms of ultra low latency, real time, and interactive. And then we ask them, what is their glass to glass expectation for latency? Here's the disconnect on this slide. Companies will say we do real time or ultra low latency, and yet only 24% of them do below 200 milliseconds. Well, I guess if we take the extra 11% for 200 milliseconds, we can say that this is 35%. There is a massive education disconnect in the industry as to what real-time streaming is, what ultra-low latency, what interactive is. I mentioned that earlier. I'm just going to repeat that point again. If you're going to talk to companies who say they do this kind of thing, make sure you get actual tests, you get specs as to how they're delivering at latencies in the 250 millisecond and lower. And then if you jump to the next slide, Steve, we then said, okay, for those who their primary business is live, and you can see in this, what we did is essentially looked at a group of respondents who said, we do more live than on demand. You can see how this changes from the roughly 50% live and on demand to 72% and 28%. They actually, their sweet spot moved slightly lower. It moved to just under 500 milliseconds versus the overall group that was at about 750 milliseconds for latency expectations. If you then, Steve, jump to the next slide, we talk about the mix of hardware versus software. And again, this is sort of a subset of those who do more live. You'll find that the understanding is there that you need to actually have hardware as part of the mix. On the right-hand side, we ask people, okay, if you're going to scale up your audience size, what would you do? The 5 points here: add hardware, acceleration infrastructure, explore more efficient software solutions, adopt a hybrid hardware software approach, or don't change strategy. if we take the hybrid and the hardware, that comes up to 42%. And I think, Dom, one of the things that you and I have seen over the years is there's this tendency to want to go to software because software is perceived to be less expensive. And yet, if you have custom solutions like an FPGA, which is designed to handle massive amounts of data traffic and computing, that we get to that balance of hardware versus software, where we often start with a codec and hardware, and then we move to software. When we need to scale, we really can't seem to do a whole lot of scaling in software. From your standpoint, as you've done large live events, how much of it has been software?
So we do probably north of 100,000 financial news events, all in software. That's all completely virtualized.
What are the audience sizes on those?
Sort of probably between 2,000 and 50,000, depending on whose financial broadcast it is, or whose end of year it is. So there's very few that go over that sort of high-end number. They tend to be the very big banks or whatever, but most of the smaller boutique investment opportunities have, small audiences. Big, aim with that workflow is reach. So it's all about hitting weird esoteric formats alongside all the mainstream ones like Windows Media and Real Media and things sometimes rear their heads because of people using arcane technology. But in terms of latency, that's surprising. That's probably less of a sensitivity. Reach is more of a sensitivity in that context. For the sports environment, it again, hardware deployment really depends on how ad hoc things are and how much you can concentrate load and how much you can fit all that load as much as you can into one static platform. If you've got like an on-prem encoder that's running 24/7 with doing 70 streams, you've probably got a very, very good candidate for going hardware and saving a lot of money on power, a lot of money on operating. Instead of probably several computers or many computers, probably reduce that to one or two. If you get your hardware density right. So there's different operational requirements, but then that's not so good if you're doing 700 events on a Friday, but Monday to Thursday you're doing no events. Because then you've got a lot of expensive tin there that you're spending money on or through the week. So it's going to really depend on the architecture.
As a matter of fact, one of the respondents actually made that very comment. They said it really depends on what workflow model I'm comparing. Where I decide on hardware versus where I decide on software. Steve, the next slide, this is a set, and these will be in the report, so I'm not going to read through or really discuss these, but we asked people to take a look at live streaming advancements. The two takeaways here, some of these are hardware and software discussions or technology discussions. Others are competition and legal issues that need to be addressed as we move toward a online first live streaming compared to the traditional over-the-air or even cable television providers. Moving on to the next slide, we've got, so we asked people to tell us their perception on the benefits of hardware acceleration for streaming workflows. This one's a fairly straightforward one, doesn't surprise me. We've got, for those who say it's a moderate to significant reduction in transcoding time for on-demand, obviously that we know hardware adds to that, or sorry, hardware reduces the time that it takes to do the transcodes. And also from a latency standpoint, the perception that live stream latency reductions occur better with hardware than software. If you go on to the next slide, though, what's interesting to me is, okay, everybody agrees that sort of technologically it makes sense to do that. What I find intriguing here is cost reductions are perceived to be quite a bit lower than the sort of, if you're doing a cost benefit analysis, the cost of it perhaps is a sticking point compared to the knowing that I can get low latencies and also perceived increasing competitive advantage. So Dom, as we look at things like power consumption, as we look at things like scaling, is there a barrier to people using hardware because they feel like the hardware costs are going to be significantly higher? Or does it goes back to this model that you mentioned about it depends on your particular use case and workflow?
I think it's going to be, and it depends. I think the hardware typically is really talking about density, and density really comes down to a sort of OpEx challenge. And if you're doing one or two streams, it's probably something you can do with quite comfortably in software anywhere. It's when you're trying to do 70 or 150 streams in 2U that hardware really starts to come to the fore. And so it's a bit of a commitment. If you've organically evolved a software thing from being a sort of small webcaster to now you're doing a few hundred events a year and so on, making that commitment to change your workflow to some hardware is I've got one and it's not broken. Do you know what I mean? So it's going to have a cost to it, even if it eventually it reduces your OpEx. So it's going to have a cost to change to it, and I think that's something that it's just a practical reality of it.
And I think the commitment thing is a good point, because it's a CapEx upfront commitment to on the bet that you're actually going to need that scale. I will say, because AMD sponsored this, and this is something that I would say even if they didn't sponsor it, one of the things that I find interesting is the card that they showed at the beginning in the video is actually a card that they've worked with AWS to put into the cloud, on the understanding that there may be a need to do, as you said, many channels that need to be transcoded at the same time.
Yep. And we've been big fans and big supporters. We integrated them. We were demonstrating we've had quite a good experience with the MA35. It's quite a good driver set, and we've been we're quite big fans of that. There's other platforms out there that we've also integrated, and customers do need that type of hardware density. And so on, and so it's important it becomes available, but it's not necessarily for every solution.
Right, and also, I guess my final point on that is the beauty here is you don't need the upfront CapEx necessarily as you're starting to scale. Yeah. You can use OpEx budget, variable rates to be able to do that through something like AWS, and then as you move to true scale, you can choose to bring that in-house. All right, so coming down on the home stretch here, let's see, I will leave this. We'll go ahead and let people see this in the report. Essentially, this shows what we've seen in other surveys where half the people say I use the cloud because it's secure and less costly. The other half say I don't use the cloud because it's not secure and not less costly. That's a debate you have to decide amongst yourself, given your actual workflows as opposed to theoretical workflows. The next slide, we talk about codecs, and I intentionally left AVC off of here when we said, does your organization have any of the following codecs in use for production workflow? Because we knew that AVC would fully dominate the responses in this. Even so, none of the above, all the comments where we use AVC. But if we ignored, so people wanted us to know that AVC still had legs. But what's interesting as you look at this is HEVC has 46%, AV1 has 18%, and then you have the other emerging ones like H.266 and MPEG-5, which are known as VVC and EVC. My take on this is that we are now 25 5 years into H.264, we continue to find ways to make it better, especially if the sweet spot is 1080p. As we move into HDR that you were talking about, Dom, and if we move into 4K, then obviously you've got options of things like H.265. AV1's a nice sweet spot sort of between those. It does well with 1080p. It does well with 4K. I guess my question is to either of you, does this surprise you that we're not really seeing heavy adoption of the MPEG-5 H.266 with HEVC having been around itself for now almost 12 years?
Not a big surprise to me.
Okay. Dom, did you want to say something on that?
Yeah, no, I just reflecting on it. I think, you know, the tools out there are making are a lot of them are set up for H.264, and a lot of them are going to keep running for a long time.
Sure.
And especially given that they're not typically single isolated machines, that when they get replaced, there's an opportunity to upgrade the whole workflow. They're parallel banks of systems where you might replace one, but it's unlikely you're going to sit down and decide to take 15 encoding platforms out in one go. So H.264 is around for a long time. It's very static, the codec market. Yes, there's some definite advantage in some edge cases, and there's still innovation happening, but there's also a very definitely good enough codec out there in H.264.
And as a matter of fact, when you mentioned that about the, you know, having to replace a cluster as opposed to just a single machine, I had been asked several years ago to do an interim chief strategy officer for a company that was looking to replace 264 with better quantization of 265. And that was the very feedback they got from organizations was, we're happy to test it, but we've got a workflow that works with 264. Help us improve 264. And indeed, the company pivoted to do precisely that from a quantization standpoint. All right, now, the last slide in this, perceived power reduction benefits of hardware acceleration. This one also was a little lower than I thought. I don't quite understand the negative impact, other than if we go to the point you were saying, Dom, where if you leave these machines on with all this hardware, you're consuming a lot of power if you're not actually using them to transcode or, lower the latency on live stream. So perhaps I'll say that negative impact part is somebody who turns a bunch of machines on and then just lets them sit and doesn't use them. But your take from a hardware standpoint with power reduction, and I know you said that you all have figured out ways to do in software, and obviously you're very attuned to the power consumption side of it. Do you find that there's a sort of a sweet spot where somebody would say, hey, look, hardware is going to be more power efficient for me than a software solution? Or
yeah, I mean, it's usually relatively simple maths. You know, I think the MA35D runs at like 30-40 watts. And you know, PSU in an average server is probably 450 watts.
True.
So you're if you can do 10 channels, so if you can do 3 or 4 channels in software on that basic unit, and then add 35 watts and do another 10 channels, that's much more efficient than adding another server. So when it comes to density and energy density, then without a doubt, getting things onto silicon is invariably a much more energy efficient way to develop the network. But it's like any silicon, it's got a degree of less flexibility to it. It's there for one purpose. So investing in it as part of an ad hoc streaming service would be, again, crazy, and probably increase your energy demand if you're only rarely using that hardware facility. But if the machine's sitting there all day, every day, churning through multiple transcodes, then it's highly likely you're going to get good energy density if you use hardware encoding.
So as I wrap up here, I think that's a key point. If you already have to scale, scaling within it, the same server with multiple hardware cards provides you both a power efficiency benefit, as well as obviously the limited need to have to actually add additional large hardware, meaning servers. But make sure that those are being used. There was a comment.
It comes with the, we mentioned it just when it comes with the disadvantage of reduced isolation. So if you do have a fault, you might have a big fault. The trick is not to have, so you still need a degree of redundancy and diversity within the system, and to plan for that within the scaling. And sometimes software is that little bit easier to do 1+1 scaling or n+1 scaling, than say hardware, where it's 70 channel plus 70 channel, whether you're doing 1+1 or 69 and 69. Do you know what I mean? It's
right.
Yeah.
Yes, I would argue, having installed systems in the past, make sure you've got especially if it's SDI, say, make sure you've got a redundant patch bay and you have redundant servers for this. So you're right, it's not a direct one-to-one correlation, but if you're looking to scale, say, beyond 4 servers, at that point, you're ultimately in an N+1 environment. So really good comment on that. Speaking of comments, we had, we're down here toward the end, and I know Steve has to pick the winner, but I'm going to just pick one comment out that somebody had made. Perhaps the reason that alternative tools aren't as prevalent is due to a need both for better education and marketing. I would 100% agree. I think besides the question of real-time versus interactive versus ultra-low latency, we also have the education around hardware and where hardware fits. So Dom, I really appreciate your insights into this. Steve, thank you for helping us understand sportsbook versus wagering. And I'm going to turn it back over to you now, Steve and Evan, to pick the winner.
Thanks so much. Great conversation. Great audience, by the way. Great comments from everybody. Thanks so much for staying engaged during what was a really fascinating chat here. We do have a winner. The walk-up music was Box of Rain by the Grateful Dead, and our winner is Matthew LeCount. So congratulations, Matthew. Thanks for staying in the whole panel, and you'll get a $50 gift card from Streaming Media Connect from Amazon. Thanks again to Tim, to Dom for being surprised and surprising. Thanks to AMD for sponsoring this great keynote. Thanks so much to Steve for sticking around the whole time and explaining the sports bet to everybody. We will have another panel in just 30 minutes. Cloud spitting, which is RAP versus cloud computing. Crowd splitting, tackling common cloud live broadcast workflow challenges. And I thank Steve for making this such a tongue twister for me. Come back in 30 minutes for that great panel hosted by Nadine Krefetz and with some really great folks. See you in 30 minutes.